Chapter 6. Other People's Money, Socialist Education, and the Problem of Incentives. Guess what? The planners are the biggest beneficiaries of socialism. Public school policy is formulated to benefit specific interest groups. Unlike socialism, capitalism serves the interest of consumers. As we've seen, socialism cannot serve citizens' interests because central planners have no way of knowing what those interests are. In the absence of the information conveyed through marketplace activity, particularly through prices, economic planners are left with highly defective sources of information: opinion polling, surveys, stated preferences, which normally differ dramatically from real or revealed preferences, and the like. Under democratic socialism, the main communicator of citizens' preferences will be election results, but these too are highly unreliable. Voters will support a particular candidate or party for any number of reasons, and the mere fact that a majority of voters supports candidate A over candidate B does not mean that the voters endorse candidate A's agenda in toto, or even the most important parts of it. Barack Obama, for instance, won election as President of the United States very convincingly, yet voters opposed, strongly in many cases, much of his core agenda, including his economic program, most notably the stimulus bill, and his health care overhaul. The available data suggest voters did not select Obama because of their support for particular items on his platform, but because they had negative feelings about George W. Bush that were transferred onto other members of Bush's party, including John McCain and Sarah Palin, along with many congressional candidates. Most developed democracies have relatively few political parties, so voters' decisions tell us little about their real preferences. Imagine a United States in which consumers could choose from only two models of automobile: black, four-door, four-cylinder economy sedans, or red, two-door, eight-cylinder sports coupes that cost twice as much. Sedan buyers might be expressing a preference for economy cars, or they may not have enough money to buy the more expensive sports car. But it could be that they simply hate red cars. It could be that, in general, they prefer sports coupes but do not like the design or drivetrain on the one sports car available in the marketplace. The fact that a majority of consumers chose one car or the other would tell us little about their overall preferences. And the same is true for voters given a choice between two major party presidential candidates, or three competing parties in a parliamentary system. Election results tell us even less at the local level, which is where school boards are elected, and thus where most day-to-day public school decisions are made. Relatively few voters cast their ballots in presidential races, but an even smaller number, much smaller proportionally, cast their ballots in school board elections. The general population in any given community knows very little about its school board, about its members and their policy agendas, or about how and why it makes decisions. Because so few people vote in school board races, and because the general population pays so little attention to school board politics and policy-making, a small group of highly motivated voters tends to have a disproportionate influence in public school decision-making. Usually, that highly influential group is dominated by people with children in the public schools, though education is far from their only motive. Prestigious public school systems tend to increase real estate values, so property owners are more likely to take an interest in public school politics than are renters. Because people who own homes also tend to be people whose children attend public schools, renters more often are younger and childless, or older people with adult children. They have a double incentive to shape school board decisions, and their incentives are to maximize the amount of resources put into public schools. Their neighbors might in fact prefer to spend a bit less on schools, or to be more vigilant about linking funding increases to performance gains. But since the people who are least enthusiastic about public school spending also tend to be renters, who pay school taxes only indirectly through higher rents, they are less likely to be as energetic in seeing to it that their interests are served by the school board. The branch of economics known as public choice theory is particularly interested in those kinds of problems, usually described as concentrated benefits versus dispersed costs. If you own a great deal of residential real estate in a particular school district, you have a strong incentive to support higher public school spending. But if you rent, and the only impact of higher spending is a $10 per month increase in rent, you have a relatively weak incentive to counteract higher spending. On a larger scale, the petroleum companies that collect billions of dollars a year in subsidies through the U.S. ethanol program BP collected $600 million in ethanol subsidies in 2010, even as members of Congress declared the oil company public enemy number one, have a strong incentive to defend those subsidies and to lobby for their expansion. But consumers paying an extra 10 cents a gallon at the pump may not even know they are contributing to a $5 billion annual payoff to the energy industry. An industry with $5 billion on the line is going to invest a lot of money in lobbying and garnering political influence. A commuter with 10 cents on the line is not. The problem of concentrated benefits versus dispersed costs means that the one source of information that central planners have access to, voters' decisions, is distorted, usually beyond recognition. It is that distortion of knowledge and incentives, and not usually corruption or malfeasance on the part of elected officials, that explains the paradoxical outcomes so familiar in democracies. A majority rule system that produces policies that the majority would not choose, policies that are in many cases exactly the opposite of what the majority would prefer. The more socialist a system is, the more it must suffer from this problem. In a highly competitive marketplace, consumers make decisions for themselves, and, most important, are forced to spend their own resources in accordance with those decisions. Under a socialist system, consumers of government-provided goods and services use the power of politics to consume at a higher level than they would if they had to pay the entire cost themselves. Most people probably would prefer owning a Ferrari to owning a Hyundai, but Hyundai sells a lot more cars because Ferraris are expensive. If people could vote to acquire Ferraris for themselves at Hyundai prices, with their neighbors being forced to make up the price difference through higher taxes, then Ferrari would sell a lot more cars. A lesson in incentives. In New York City, landlord arson became so common after the imposition of rent control that the city responded with special welfare allowances. For a while, burned-out tenants were moved to the top of the list for coveted public housing. That then gave tenants an incentive to burn down the buildings in which they lived, which they did, often moving television sets and furniture out onto the sidewalk before starting the fire. William Tucker, Zoning, Rent Control, and Affordable Housing, 1991. Who reaps the profits of socialism? But consumers are not the only interest group that is able to game the system under the socialist model of providing goods and services. As strong as highly motivated consumers' incentives may be, there is another group of people with an even stronger set of incentives, the central planners themselves, i.e., the government employees who staff the socialist bureaucracies. Again, the American public school system provides a telling example of how these incentives play out. Though the United States is a broadly capitalist country, primary-secondary education is conducted under an almost exclusively socialist model. Indeed, the U.S. school system is more deeply socialized than Soviet agriculture was under Stalin. About 90% of U.S. students attend government schools for primary and secondary education, and practically 100% of taxpayers pay into the system. The Soviets, for all their effort, never managed to achieve 90% socialization of agriculture. This comparison is not a facetious one. Just as Soviet apparatchiks used their positions of influence to command better wages, better food, better housing, and other privileges not accorded to the vast proletariat, on whose behalf they alleged to labor, American government workers, and government school workers in particular, enjoy far higher wages, better health care benefits, more job security, guaranteed pensions, generous paid vacations, and other benefits not dreamt of by the working people on whose behalf they allegedly engage in public service. And the economics of the U.S. public school system would be readily familiar to any student of the Soviet economy. The economist Paul Craig Roberts tells a relevant anecdote about the shortcomings of Soviet economic planning. When the output of a nail factory was measured in total units of production, the managers of the factory decided to produce great quantities of small, thin nails. When the measure of output was changed to gross tonnage, the managers switched to making big, heavy nails. In both cases, the producers produced what the measurers measured, regardless of whether the economy actually needed lots of small nails or a fewer number of heavy nails. The socialist economics of the U.S. public school system operates in precisely the same way. When schools were measured by their graduation rates, they lowered standards and graduated more students. When they were measured by standardized test scores, they neglected general education to focus on the subjects covered by the tests, and lobbied to have the tests designed in such a way as to maximize their students' scores. In some instances, educators organized their students to systematically cheat on standardized tests. When extra money became available for special needs students, educators began to classify more and more of their students as special needs. While reporting on school budgets in a school district outside Philadelphia, I found one school district went so far as to classify its gifted and talented program as a special needs program, thereby maximizing both its funding and its measured success in educating special needs students. Of course, the best way for managers to meet the goals set for them by the central planners is to take over the process of writing the central plan themselves. Studying Soviet industrial production, Professor Roberts observed, "When I first examined this system, it was clear to me that signals interpreted by managers constituted the main difference between the Soviet economy and a normal market economy. In a normal market, managers organize production by interpreting price and profit signals. In the Soviet economy, managers interpreted gross output indicators. The critical difference is that gross output indicators are irrational from the standpoint of economic efficiency. Soviet managers were as autonomous as their market counterparts. They set their own planned targets by disguising their productive capacity and overstating their resource needs. Soviet planners served primarily as supply agents for enterprises, endeavoring to supply the enterprises with sufficient inputs to fulfill their gross output targets. The system of material supply could seldom perform this task, and Soviet factory managers made barter arrangements with one another and produced their own inputs. This activity led me to the conclusion that the Soviet economy, like a market, was organized polycentrically and not hierarchically as a planning system. The central plan was little more than the summation of the factory managers' individual plans." The New York City Public Schools formulated a 5-year plan in 2008, and they conducted their business in much the same way as the Soviet factory managers did. Their collective 5-year plan was simply a summation of the pre-existing preferences of the factory managers, in this case the teachers, as represented through their unions, along with the principals and other administrators. In fact, the teachers so dominated the process that the 5-year plan was focused on a single central desire of the education factory managers, reducing class sizes. The educational achievement literature shows little connection between class size and student achievement. But smaller classes mean much less work for educators, but not less pay, so reducing classroom headcounts has long been a key goal for educators and the education bureaucracies. Likewise, the teachers' unions have long fought for the requirement of advanced degrees for many teachers, or for significantly higher pay for teachers who hold master's degrees or better. The research shows no relationship between teachers holding advanced degrees and student performance, but more advanced degrees mean higher aggregate salaries for educators, as well as for administrators, and perhaps more important, significantly higher pension benefits, because pensions are directly related to salaries during the last years of a teacher's career. Professor Roberts had a difficult time assembling meaningful economic data for his studies of Soviet industrial production. Happily for students of mixed economy socialism, we have much better data about the economics of American public education, and they mirror the trends in socialist production across industries and nations. Inputs are misaligned, and resources are misallocated. Consumers' interests are not served, but the apparatchiks' interests are. In short, real spending, which is to say inflation-adjusted spending, on education in the United States has skyrocketed, and not just over recent decades. Real spending on schooling in the United States has grown an average of 3.5% above and beyond the rate of inflation for a century, as reported by Eric A. Hanishek and Dale W. Jorgensen in their National Research Council study, Improving America's Schools. While real expenditures have been climbing, real educational achievement has flatlined in most cases, but in many cases has declined, and in some cases has declined radically. More spending for less output. That's a good working definition of socialist economic outcomes. The spending on U.S. education, Hanishek and Jorgensen find, has been driven by 3 factors: educators' salaries, reductions in classroom size, and spending on non-instructional expenses. That lattermost category includes things like administrative costs and the salaries of non-educator personnel, such as counselors, assistants, nurses, and the like. But it also hides a good deal of money directed into the pockets of teachers. Retirees' expenses, for instance. The generous pensions and lavishly funded health care benefits that teachers' unions demand from taxpayers are classified as non-instructional costs, since they go to retired educators instead of active classroom teachers. Taken together, these three factors add up to a program of paying teachers much more to do much less work, without any concomitant demand that they get better results from their reduced workloads. As Hanishek and Jorgensen put it, matched against the growth in spending, student performance has, at best, stayed constant, and may have fallen. While aggregate performance measures are somewhat imprecise, all point to no gains in student performance over the past 2 decades. While there has been slight movement, the overall picture is one of stagnating performance. Perhaps the most dramatic finding of analyses of schools is that smaller class sizes usually have had no general impact on student performance, even though they have obvious implications for school costs. Moreover, the basic econometric evidence is supported by experimental evidence, making it one of the clearest results from an extensively researched topic. Although some specific instruction may be enhanced by smaller classes, student performance in most classes is unaffected by variations in class size in standard operations of, say, 15 to 40 students. Nevertheless, even in the face of high costs that yield no apparent performance benefits, the overall policy of states and local districts has been to reduce class sizes in order to try to increase quality. A second, almost equally dramatic example is that obtaining an advanced degree does little to ensure that teachers do a better job in the classroom. It is just as likely that a teacher with a bachelor's degree would elicit high performance from students as would a teacher with a master's degree. Again, since a teacher's salary invariably increases with the completion of a master's degree, this is another example of increased expenditures yielding no gains in student performance. These resource effects are important for 2 reasons. First, variations in instructional expenditures across classrooms are largely determined by the pupil-teacher ratio and the salary of the teacher, which, in turn, is largely determined by the teacher's degree and experience. If these factors have no systematic influence on student performance, which the evidence shows they do not, expansion of resources in the ways of the past are unlikely to improve performance. Second, either explicitly or implicitly, schools have pursued a program of adding these specific resources. Schools currently have record-low pupil-teacher ratios, record-high numbers for completion of master's degrees, and more experienced teachers than at any time at least since 1960. These factors are the result of many specific programs that have contributed to the rapid growth in per-pupil spending, but have not led to improvements in student performance. Schools do not try to ensure that increased student performance flows from increased expenditures. That last sentence is particularly telling. Educators do not try to ensure that increased student performance flows from increased expenditures. But why? For the people who run the schools, increased expenditures are a net benefit in and of themselves, regardless of whether they produce superior results. The bigger the budget, the bigger the salary of the administrator charged with managing it. The more money in the system, the more will be paid out in salaries and benefits. It is worth noting that much of the spending classified as non-instructional costs ends up enriching school system employees through pension and medical benefit programs. When there is no link between payment and performance, prices inevitably rise and quality decreases, which is precisely what has happened in American public schools. But because the price is hidden through a Byzantine system of taxes and subsidies, rather than being explicit, as in the form of an annual tuition check, the consumers of those services do not directly experience the economic dysfunction of the system. The lure of other people's money. There are 4 ways in which you can spend money. You can spend your own money on yourself. When you do that, why then you really watch out what you're doing, and you try to get the most for your money. Then you can spend your own money on somebody else. For example, I buy a birthday present for someone. Well, then I'm not so careful about the content of the present, but I'm very careful about the cost. Then I can spend somebody else's money on myself. And if I spend somebody else's money on myself, then I'm sure going to have a good lunch. Finally, I can spend somebody else's money on somebody else. And if I spend somebody else's money on somebody else, I'm not concerned about how much it is, and I'm not concerned about what I get. And that's government. and that's close to 40% of our national income. Milton Friedman, Fox News interview, 2004. Calling Gordon Gekko. Compare this model of providing goods and services with practically any product provided through the competitive marketplace. Government education advocates, such as Barack Obama, give passionate speeches about the need for education, about the critical role it plays in our society. But they continue to advocate what is, let us remember, a 19th century Prussian approach to education. The United States in the 21st century is not very much like 19th century Prussia. Prussia today isn't much like Prussia then either, but we still use its educational methods. We would never think of using its transportation methods. Horsepower was literally horse power. Its communication methods, telegraphs, or its military technology, muzzle loaders and bayonets. But government-run systems have a way of preserving themselves well past any rational point, which is why the United States still maintains the helium reserve it established for dirigible warfare, presumably to fight those 19th century Prussians. Compare our failing public schools with our cellular phones. Cell phones and cell phone service are enormously competitive industries, in which innovation and capital from around the world are channeled, with no 5-year plan, amazingly enough, to serve the needs of consumers. They have improved immeasurably over a short period of time. In 2010, moviegoers watching the trailer for the Oliver Stone film Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, got a big laugh out of the 1985 vintage cell phone that white-collar criminal Gordon Gekko reclaims from the property room as he is released from prison. It's a great gag. The thing is as big as a cinder block. But there's more to the joke than the clunky aesthetic of Reagan-era technology. Gordon Gekko's cell phone, the Motorola Dynatac, cost the equivalent of just under $10,000 in 2010 dollars. Monthly service fees ran into hundreds of dollars. Basic features of 2010 cell phones, like text messaging and email, were unheard of. Even a Wall Street titan like Gordon Gekko couldn't download a song from the iTunes store. In 2010, you couldn't give Gordon Gekko's cell phone, his prized status symbol, his most conspicuous indicator of wealth and sophistication, to a kid in a housing project in the South Bronx. But that same South Bronx kid, who has access to some of the best communication technology in the history of mankind, is stuck with a failing public school, a third-rate version of a 19th century Prussian model that at its best probably would not serve his interests. The difference is that the socialist model of education is not designed to serve his interests, while the private enterprise model, which must compete for customers and their money, has no choice but to serve its customers' interests. The free market model has its shortcomings too, but in most cases a bad product or defective service is driven out of the marketplace by competition. Under a socialist model, there is no competition to drive out bad products and rotten services, which is why a visitor from 1929 would recognize your public schools, but would be amazed by the cell phones they give away for free at your local mall. What is worth noting, and what must be most amazing to the true believers among the central planning authorities, is that something as miraculous as the cellular phone network, which has brought technology that was once the stuff of Buck Rogers comics into the hands of ordinary people, including poor people, lacked any coordinated national or global plan to do so. In fact, is it precisely the absence of a central plan that has allowed the industry to thrive and to innovate? If we had structured the provision of cellular phone service the way we have education, the incentives would have been radically different. The guy selling the 1985 Dynatac would make the same profit as the guy selling the iPhone. Consumers would have no choice between Verizon's good network and AT&T's spotty one, and would simply be assigned a network based on which street they live on. Because everybody would be taxed to provide cell phones for everybody else, only the wealthy would have enough money left over to enter the private cell phone market, so innovation would be stifled. With no competition, there would be no incentive to drive down prices. In fact, there would be every incentive to drive up prices. Given the inherent defects of the socialist model of providing goods and services, one has to wonder, why would anybody choose socialism in the first place? There are lots of possible answers to that question: class resentment, socioeconomic envy, risk aversion, irrational distrust of profit-seeking entrepreneurs, etc. The best answer, however, may surprise many people. Sweden.